Yeah. Hi everyone, good afternoon. I think we'll get started. Welcome to this week's Indonesia study group. My name is Eve Warburton. I'm a research fellow at the Department of Political and Social Change and director of the Indonesia Institute. It's a real pleasure to be chairing this week's ISG with a very special guest, come all the way from Singapore in the US, Assistant Professor Nick Kuipers. Before we begin formally, I would just like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So it is really exciting that we have Nick here with us today. For anyone who isn't familiar with Nick's profile, he is a really exciting early career political scientist who has been working on Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia and more broad comparative work as well. He is assistant professor at the National University of Singapore and also presidential young professor there in the US. But he's soon to be taking up a new position as assistant professor at Princeton's Department of Politics. So before he sort of disappears to North America, he's taken this opportunity to come and visit us here in Australia, in Canberra, and we're very grateful for that, for his decision to come and meet with us here. So Nick's research focuses on Southeast Asia, as I said, but he's also a comparative political scientist. He also, his work draws on political economy and public policy. His ongoing projects are focused on the impact of institutions that govern political and bureaucratic selection in Indonesia. And he has a book contract with Cambridge for his manuscript entitled States Against Nations, which I thought was a really cool title. Very good. So that should be, look out for it probably next year, I guess, or something, something like that. So just for anyone who might, and people online who might not have attended an ISG before, the basic format is that the presenter will speak for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes of Q&A. This is a hybrid event, so we will be taking questions online as well, but we'll give a priority to those who have come in person. So if you are online, then you should be writing your questions in the Q&A box. Have I covered everything? Is that right? Okay, in that case, Nick, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Eve, and thanks for the invitation. This is my first time at ANU, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'll just jump right in. So today I'm presenting joint work with Alan Xiao entitled Preference Mismatch for Environmental Policy in Indonesia. And before I jump in, I'll just say a few things about this project. The first is that this is the sort of first in a series of papers that makes use of new data that we collected based on a panel survey of local candidates for legislative office in Indonesia. So this is really just one part of a bigger research agenda. The second thing I'll say is that we're in search of a better title for this project. So if anyone has any suggestions at the end of it that's perhaps less sober, then please don't hesitate to recommend something. So we're motivated by three sets of observations, and this sort of gave us a reason to study this question of environmental policy in Indonesia. So the first, and I think most obvious, is that Indonesia faces a series of what we call interlocking environmental challenges. So the first, and I think the most prominent, is this issue of deforestation, and especially the use of fire for clearing primary and secondary forest in Indonesia. So in the course of writing this paper, there's a statistic: Indonesia lost 31 million hectares of tree cover since 2001, which is approximately the size of Germany, right? So I was quite surprised by the scale of this deforestation. As you'll know, much of this is commodity-driven deforestation, with both large plantations and corporations, as well as smallholders clearing primary and secondary forest in order to make way for, say, palm oil plantations. Right? And there's this vibrant debate about the extent to which these different actors are contributing, to which we're agnostic, right? We're not going to engage this question in this project. This forest conversion often uses burning, in part because it's cheaper than mechanical means of clearing primary and secondary forest. But in times of drought, this can, of course, spark wildfires that then releases tremendous amounts of CO2. And so during El Nino years in particular, as it was in 2023, this leads to huge amounts of forest cover lost. So in 2023, Indonesia lost about 1 million hectares to forest fires. Another issue, I think probably less prominent, but still salient, is this question of flooding and sea level rise, which will become more salient as climate change increases sea levels. And this is especially salient in coastal areas of Southeast Asia, of which Indonesia is, of course, one, that face land subsidence, right? So Jakarta is perhaps the most prominent example of this. And yearly, as a function of its flooding, it faces 300 million USD in damages. And one of the more recent issues to come on the scene, but which I think is now increasingly salient, is this question of mining in rare earth metal extraction in Indonesia. So in 2022, Indonesia supplied nearly 50% of the world's nickel, which is a key input to electric vehicle batteries. And so as the EV industry takes off, I think we're likely to see this number increase. Indonesia sits on about 20% of the world's deposits of nickel. Now, a negative externality of this extraction is that during the smelting process, it's combined with toxic chemicals in order to purify the nickel, which then get, at the end of the process, dejected oftentimes into waterways, polluting the environment. The second observation that we're motivated by is that despite these problems, politicians on balance in Indonesia, policymakers in Indonesia, seem reticent to undertake costly environmental action to remedy these issues. Right? So politicians, at least at the national level, openly care more about economic development in what Eve calls resource nationalism than I think environmental conservation. Right? So this raw nickel export ban is perhaps the most recent example of this in all the conversations around downstreaming the natural resource sector. I think this sort of speaks to a concern with economic development over, say, environmental conservation. It's incentivizing the construction of a domestic mining industry. The blanket ban on new forest concessions in primary forests, I think, was a good sort of step forward, but it hasn't been matched with genuine enforcement, right? There's quibbling around what's a primary versus a secondary forest, and local offices are often understaffed and underfunded. But a lot of the action, as you'll know, is at the local level. So with decentralization in the early 2000s, local governments were nominally handed the policy portfolio of environmental management. Right? And I say nominally and I say mostly, in part because the central government has clawed back a lot of this authority over the last 10 years. But still, local district level governments hold a tremendous amount of authority for environmental management. Right? So there's, I think, several consequences of this. First, is that the incentives at the local level are different than perhaps at the national level. Right? So the revenues derived from, say, logging permits or historically mining concessions constituted own source revenues, which are scrutinized less than central government transfers, and thus provides an incentive for local politicians to cultivate these resources through environmental extraction. The frontline enforcement of environmental protections, like, say, the blanket ban on forest concessions on primary forests, relies on district level officials to implement these things, right? But district level officials, particularly those that are directly managed by local politicians, are plagued by clientelism and clientelistic exchange that undermine the enforcement of a lot of these protections. So the second observation is that there's very little policy action in this space. And the first observation is that there should be policy action in this space given the scale of the crisis. The third observation is that in the background, Indonesian voters actually strongly care about environmental issues. So this is drawn from some of the data that I'll be presenting later on in the presentation, in which on the x-axis, I'm showing you the share of Indonesian voters who say the issue of pollution is very important to them. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you different provinces across Indonesia. And then this red line is the average number. Right? So on average, about 58% of respondents in Indonesia say pollution is this very important issue. And there's some regional variation, but on balance, it's high across all provinces. And I'm sure as a room, we could spend the next 30 minutes trying to break down why this provincial variation obtains. But there's some interesting things. So Sulawesi Barat, for instance, has the highest level, which is a region that is exposed to, say, rare earth mineral extraction. But places in Kalimantan that deal with burning in particular see very few respondents comparatively saying pollution is important. Right? So there's some interesting variation, but on balance, there's demand for action on this issue. So this motivates our project, right? So standard theories of political representation and political science and political economy predict that politicians should move policy to align with voter preferences. Otherwise, they face electoral sanction, right? So why is it that Indonesian politicians are underproducing environmental policy when we should expect to see sort of them moving to the median voter? So what we do in the paper is to develop a simple model of policy in action to try and understand why it is that there's this underproduction of environmental policy. And what we do in the model is emphasize two key frictions. The first is what we call costs to policy action. And it's sort of predicated on this observation that politicians face a range of costs for deviation from the status quo of environmental exploitation, right? And of course, all else equal, politicians would prefer not to act at all if they didn't have to, right? But under this, I think, premise of the model is this idea that oftentimes elite interests can prevent politicians from acting through imposing these extra legal costs. We also emphasize what we call costs to communication. And this is the idea that voters face costs to communicating their preferences to politicians, right? You have to take time out of your day. You have to identify, say, a broker, an intermediary, a politician to communicate these preferences to. And of course, communicating your preferences on one issue incurs opportunity costs on another. So if you're talking about environmental policy, you're not talking about, say, health or education. And so what the model does is try and work through how these different costs are preventing environmental policy from obtaining in Indonesia. And so to evaluate these two different frictions, what we do is join two sources of data. The first is a voter survey conducted in December of 2023, in which we had about 5,000 respondents. And what we did was we asked voters about their preferences for environmental policy. The second source of data is this candidate survey that I mentioned, which is, I think, unique and like I said, is going to be the basis for several projects. And what we did was we surveyed 800 legislative candidates for DPRD2 office in Indonesia. And we surveyed the same 800 candidates in November, in January, and then we have the final third wave in the field right now. And what we do in that survey is we gauge their preferences, their personal preferences for environmental policy. We gauge their perceptions of voters' preferences. We ask them, what do you think voters care about, right? And then in the second wave, we conducted an experiment in which we provided them with information about voters' preferences, right? So they had erroneous beliefs and we tried to correct them in the second wave. And so just to, I think, get rid of the suspense and just tell you what we're going to do in the next 30 minutes, we have three findings that come out of this exercise. So the first is a descriptive comparison of preferences. So we show that voters care about environmental issues more than politicians do, by a large margin. The second thing we show is that politicians massively underestimate how much voters care about environmental policy by a margin of 20 to 25%. So we think this speaks to the idea that voters face frictions or costs to communicating their preferences, right? It's for this reason that politicians perhaps underestimate whether voters want environmental policy. The second finding hinges on this experiment, right? So like I said, in the second wave, we corrected politicians' erroneous beliefs about voter preferences. And we showed that providing politicians with this correct information about voter preferences induces significant learning, right? In other words, they update their expectations of what voters want, right? So we think this is a good thing. But then we asked politicians if they would support concrete policy issues, things like a carbon tax or a blanket ban on deforestation on secondary forests. And we saw no effect of our experiment on moving these policy issues. And so we think this is sort of surprising, right? Politicians are learning, they're updating their expectations of what voters want, but they're not turning that into actual policy support. And so our third finding tries to explain this, what we call policy in action. And what we point to are the costs of policy action associated with clientelistic exchange. So this idea of elite capture in particular. And what we do is we construct an index of local level clientelism at the Kabupaten level, which is based on public officials' assets that they have to report to the KPK. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later on. And we use this index of local public officials' assets to say which places have high clientelism and which places have low clientelism. And we show that our experiment, our intervention, worked to nudge policy action, to increase policy action, but only in places where this index is low. In other words, only in places where elite capture is low does voter information translate into policy support. Okay, so that's the sort of summary of the presentation in 15 minutes. So for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to go through and sort of expand out on these points. And so I'll start with this simple model of policy in action. I'll then go to the context and sort of take stock of where things stand with environmental policy in Indonesia. And then I'll spend a good deal of time talking about this research design, these two surveys, in part because this data is, the voter survey is currently public and the candidate survey will eventually be made public. And so I think it should be a resource to people in this room. So I'll spend time describing those two, and then I'll go through the results. And I should say, I know there are economists in the room. I'm happy to stop and answer questions throughout if anyone wants to clarify a point or two. Okay, so like I say, what we do is we develop this simple model of policy and action. In this model, you can think about two actors, right? Voters and politicians. And voters will express a policy preference, let's call it V, but expressing this preference is costly, as I mentioned earlier. It's costly in terms of opportunity costs. It's costly in terms of sort of locational costs, transaction costs. It takes time, for instance, to communicate a preference, is the simplest way to think. And so what this means is that all else equal, voters are going to underexpress their preferences. Right? They're going to underexpress their true preferences because they incur cost to doing so. Politicians, for their part, generally want to meet voters' policy preferences. Right? They produce policy P as a function of voter preferences V. And they do this to avoid electoral sanction. But policy action itself is also costly. Right? It takes time, for instance, in the easiest case, takes time to prepare legislation. But also, as I said, there are these extra legal costs that can be imposed by elite interests who might say withhold campaign financing in the event of deviation from the status quo. And so all else equal, politicians will also underdeliver. And in this conceptual framework, the result is policy inaction in the equilibrium. Voters are going to underexpress their preferences. Politicians are thus going to underdeliver, both as a function of voters underexpressing and as a function of the costs incurred to policy action. And this creates, I think, a descending spiral. Voters will further underexpress because they anticipate that politicians are going to underdeliver. Right? So this is, I think, a very bleak portrait of policy action. And to be clear, this isn't specific to environmental policy. This isn't specific to Indonesia. What we're using this model for is instead to structure our analysis, to draw our attention to these different frictions that might help us make sense of the results that we see later on. So what we do is we take several predictions from this model to our data. The first prediction is that our framework anticipates a discrepancy between what we call voters' first-order preferences and politicians' second-order beliefs. And so just to familiarize you with the vocabulary, first-order preferences are one's own preferences over some policy issue. Right? So how much do I want, say, action on environmental issues, health, education, so on and so forth. Second order beliefs are one's beliefs about someone else's preferences. Right? And this can be in the aggregate or in an individual setting. Right? And so we think that there's a disjunction between voters' first order preferences and politicians' second order beliefs. The second prediction is that we think that if we can hotwire the process, if we can circumvent voters having to communicate their preferences and incurring that cost C, we think that providing politicians with voters' first order beliefs should encourage action. It should nudge politicians into policy action, but only if their second order beliefs are wrong, right? If they correctly believe what voters want, there's no scope for this information to improve what policy they're producing. And the third observation that we take to the data or prediction is that if politicians' perceived costs to action are sufficiently high, no amount of information can move them to policy action, right? If they're looking down the game tree and they see that they're going to lose out on, say tens of millions of dollars in potential rents, these costs are extremely high. Inaction will persist even after the expression of voter preferences.
Sorry, can I clarify?
Yeah.
In what sense is it possible for the voters to express their preference?
In the sense that we can think about these costs flexibly, but the way that we document into the paper is in a very individual sense. It takes time to express your preferences.
So not as a collective action like.
So we can also think about that as well, right? I mean, there's a sort of coordination problem as well to communicating your preferences in a way that'll incentivize action. But we can also think about opportunity costs as well, right? I mean, a voter can express preferences over all issues that they care about. Instead, you sort of have to prioritize one or the other, right? And so I think we're thinking about costs very flexibly, right? I mean, I think there's many different ways to think. Okay, so these are sort of the three predictions that we take to the data. Okay, so where do things currently stand with environmental policy in Indonesia? I'm going to caveat this by saying my co-author is the expert on environmental policy in Indonesia, and so this is really his domain. But you know, I learned a lot in preparing this paper on where things I think currently stand, and there's good news and there's bad news, right? So the good news is that the central government has taken several proactive steps to manage the impacts of climate change. It has at least nominally suggested that it intends to act on these things. So the Ministry of Environment and Forestry developed a sort of carbon action plan that included a projection of peak emissions in 2030 and a promise of carbon zero in 2050, right? Now, this is sort of a nominal promise. I think very dubious that this will actually occur. There is, of course, a blanket ban on primary forest conversion for commodity use, but again, has been met with sort of variable or weak enforcement. And the recent tax harmonization law proposed a framework for a carbon tax in 2021. Now, the bad news, I think the Jokowi administration's record thus far over the last 10 years has prioritized exploitation and economic development over environmental conservation. So I think the Econ plan is a nice example of this, right? It reflects little concern for adaptation or mitigation of Jakarta's coastal subsidence or environmental challenges, but instead sort of reflects a willingness to just sort of cut and run, right? Now, there's a lot of motivations for Econ, and I don't think the environmental concerns are the only or even the primary concern, but it does reflect this tendency. The centralization of mining concessions and mining permits in 2020, I think, perhaps initially looked like an environmental victory, but holds less promise than before, right? And surely reflects a concern with trying to sort of motivate further extraction and generate further economic development. The carbon tax, which I mentioned earlier, was initially slated to be introduced in 2022, but was pushed back to 2025, and I think is unlikely to even be introduced then, right? And will further be pushed back after that as well. Right? Now, like I said, you know, a lot of the action is actually at the local level, and this motivates us to focus on these candidates for DPRD2 office. So with the decentralization laws in the late 90s and early 2000s, management of the environment was ostensibly devolved down to district level government. The challenge with this is that local governments in Indonesia are plagued with corruption and elite capture through clientelistic exchange, right? And this undermines their ability to, I think, effectively regulate environmental concerns. And so this is sort of a graph based on data scraped from that KPK website, in which you look at the level of corruption, I think indictments, or it might actually be convictions, at different levels of government. And the blue line is for the local level government, the district level governments. And you see this sort of spiking in 2016, which probably doesn't only reflect doesn't only reflect genuine corruption, but perhaps other forces as well. But I think it does speak to this this level of corruption that exists at local levels. And so the way that we think about clientelism in Indonesia, or at the local level for our purposes here when it comes to these legislative candidates, is to think about the campaign finance costs that are incurred to politicians as they participate in this exchange. So as you'll know, candidates often shower voters in cash in advance of elections, which drives up the cost of campaign finance. Parties sometimes, but not always, expect candidates to pay for positions on ballots or legislative lists, also driving up the cost of campaign finance. And so to finance these really, I think, high upfront costs, politicians turn to several different means of recouping their investments. Right? So if they finance their outlays through personal finance, creates incentive to grab. But if they turn instead to outside donors, as they often do, this creates incentives for influence peddling, which is important for our purposes in the experiment that I'm going to show in a moment, in the sense that these outside donors that expect influence are often large firms or businessmen whose profits, at least in rural Kabupaten, depend on, say, environmental extraction, right? So they can impose costs by withholding the donations they would otherwise give. And so all of this conspires to, I think, push environmental concerns further down onto the range of issues that politicians care about. So here I'm showing you the percentage on the, y-axis, the percentage of candidates who mention these different issues in their official campaign platform. And the gray bar are development, economic development, the blue bar is health, and then the green bar is environmental issues. Okay, and what you see is that environmental issues receive the least amount of attention. Now, I have these figures for 2019 and 2024, and there's a slight increase over that period, but still reflects, I think, very little attention being given to environmental issues on these campaign platforms. Okay, so it's in this context that we start to collect data to try and figure out what explains this sort of comparative or relative lack of interest in environmental issues in local Indonesian politics. And so the first source of data is collected jointly with my colleague at NUS, Nathaniel Sumartoyo. And we call this, this was singkatan-driven titling, as you'll see. We call it Surveys on Indonesians' Knowledge of and Attitudes on Politics, so it's called SIKAP. And what we do in this project is conduct weekly surveys of 1,600 Indonesian voters. And we've been doing this since November 2023, and we'll continue doing it until January 2025. These are online surveys conducted by CINT, which used to be Lucid. But we use a quota sampling procedure that ensures representation on region, age, and gender, right? And so there are concerns with the reliability of online surveys, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but we think this quota sampling procedure actually gives us pretty good results. Right? And what we do is we measure first order and second order preferences. So on the first count, we ask voters, here are several issues or problems. How important or unimportant do you think these issues are? And for our purposes here, the most important relate to climate change and pollution. Now, like I said, one of the things we do is we try and benchmark our online survey estimates to see how biased they are, right? There are concerns that they're not good at capturing population level estimates. And so what we do is we benchmark it against a presumed ground truth of the actual election results. And so in advance of the election, we ask voters on this same survey, who do you intend to vote for? Prabowo, Ganjar, Anies. And what we found is that the week before the election, our survey predicted a 56.6% Prabowo vote share, which I think is statistically indistinguishable from the 58% that he actually obtained. And in fact, Burhan and Saiful are not in the room. We did better than the sort of random sampling procedures of face-to-face surveys that were predicting 51, 52%, right?
Actually, that's not entirely correct.
Really?
Yeah, Burhan had
56?
In the lead up?
yes, the week, 2 weeks before look at the last.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, we did just as good as but I think still counts. And so one of the things, and this is sort of a tangential point, but I think folks in the room will find it interesting. We really try and diagnose why it is that we did so well, right? And one of the things that we think is going on is that compared to other contexts, there's comparatively little educational polarization in it compared to, say, the US or Western Europe or even India. And this means that even though surveys are unbalanced on educational composition, online surveys are getting good at capturing population level parameters with educationally unrepresentative samples. Right? So for instance, if our survey was unbalanced on age, which is increasingly polarized in Indonesia, we would do a very bad job at capturing the population level estimates. But instead we have quotas on age. And so I think we do a good job. Right? So this gives us confidence in this data source. And just to give you a sense of what voters' first order preferences are, here in the green lines, we have environmental issues, climate change and pollution. And then the other issues are more traditional, say, public goods like education and health. And what you see is that environmental issues aren't the top concern for voters over this period, but they're in the running, right? So approximately 60% of voters say pollution is very important, which compares sort of, I think, similarly to the concern that voters have with the provision of healthcare, right? Which I think is very interesting. The second data source that we draw on is this local legislative candidate survey. And this is, and how am I doing on time, by the way? I think I'm
You've got about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay.
Is that right?
15
minutes.
Great. So the second source of data is this local legislative candidate survey. And here what we did is we conducted 3 panel surveys, so a 3-way panel of 800 legislative candidates for the DPRD bill. And we conducted these in November, January, and then like I said, the final wave is wrapping up right now. And this is part of a broader project to understand real-time dynamics of politicians and voter responses to the electoral landscape, how politicians are responding to changes in voter preferences, not just on environmental issues, but a broader suite of issues. So the way we did this is that we randomly sampled 80 kabupaten kota, and then we randomly sampled 10 candidates in those kabupaten kota. What we did was we focused specifically on candidates in the top 3 list positions, on the assumption that outside the top 3 list positions, you're going to start to get candidates who aren't super serious about their campaign, perhaps, right? And then we focused on the top 10 parties as of available polling on October 1st. So, for instance, we don't survey PSE candidates because on October 1st they were below 1%. I'll just leave it there. This is a good survey. The initial contact rate was 80%, and then the recontact rate on both follow-up surveys was 92%. Right. And so what we did on this in terms of measurement was we did the same first order preferences measurement, and then we did a measurement of second order beliefs, asking them what they thought voters believed. Now, the really, I think, neat thing about the panel design is that we were able to do in a follow-up survey an experiment in which we wanted to see if a reduction in the amount of error in politicians' second order beliefs led to changes in their support of different policy items. Right? And so we designed this experiment in which at the beginning of wave 2, enumerators gave half of the respondents basically a survey deck, a report, a briefing on what voters wanted, right, in terms of what their policy preferences were. We also showed them what other politicians' preferences were from wave 1. And so we can show them that there's this big gap, for instance, between what voters want and what politicians. We didn't just focus on environmental issues. This report also included voter preferences on other issues like health and education as well. We debriefed all the candidates. So the experiment occurred at the beginning of wave 1, right? And then at the end of wave, at the beginning of wave 2, and then at the end of wave 2, the candidates that were in the so-called control condition, we gave them the same report, right? We don't want to, if there were any electoral effects of this particular intervention, we don't want to withhold the benefit of seeing voter preferences from the quote-unquote control candidate. And then for the measurement of whether or not this experiment worked, we introduced these measures of support for policy issues. So we tried to capture politicians' perceived sense of urgency on these different environmental issues. And then we also asked if they would support concrete policy measures like a carbon tax or a blanket ban on new deforestation, including on secondary forests. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you a little bit undersell the way you do the experiment. So you did randomize between the half candidates groups.
Yes, yeah, it's a randomized experiment. Yeah. Okay, so on to the results. So the first thing that I'm going to do is look at our descriptive results. So comparing first order preferences between politicians and voters. And so what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the percent of individuals saying a given issue is very important. And on the y-axis, you see the different issues. The black dot are voters' first order preferences. What voters say is very important. The gray dots are what politicians say are very important to them. So I think there are sort of 3 things to highlight about this graph. So the first is if you look only at the black dots, only at voters' preferences, the percentage of voters who say these environmental issues down here, pollution and climate change, are very important, are lower than, say, the percent who say health and education are important. but they compare more or less equivalently, right? So here you're looking about 50-55%. Here you're looking at 65 to 70%, right? So there's a gap, but it's not as big as I think perhaps we would expect. The second thing is that politicians care more than voters about the provision of health and education. I think it's more important than voters do. And then the third point, which is I think really the sort of motivating thing for us, is that voters care more about pollution and climate change than do politicians. So here you see about a 10 to 20 percentage point gap on these 2 points. Okay. The next finding looks at politicians' second order beliefs, what they think voters think are important. So these black dots are voters' first order beliefs, what their preferences for action are, or what their preferences for policy are. And so these are the same black dots as before. The gray dots are now what politicians think, voters think is very important. And so this is, I think, really interesting. So the first 3 rows show that politicians are very, very good at estimating how much voters care about traditional welfare issues like health and education. Right? They're really, really good at it. It's statistically indistinguishable. But they're really, really, really bad at estimating how much voters care about these more, let's just say, new policy issues, right? Like concerns about minority rights or concerns over the environment. And so they're about 25 percentage points off the mark on those issues. I think this is the most interesting graph of the presentation. I could spend a long time spinning theories about what explains the difference between these different policy issues, and I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A. But we don't have, I think, strong evidence to try and diagnose why politicians are good at estimating voter support for health and education and why they're bad when it comes to the environment. For our purposes, the point is that they are bad at estimating support for the environment, right? And so just to sort of summarize these descriptive results, voters report higher first order beliefs about the importance of environmental issues compared to politicians. And politicians hold incorrect second order beliefs about voter support or voter concern with these environmental issues. And so the second part of the results takes up this question, there is this gap between voters' first order beliefs and politicians' estimates of those beliefs. What happens if we correct those beliefs? What happens if we give them information about what voters want? And so that's what we do right here, right? So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is the estimated treatment effect of providing politicians with that report about voter preferences. And on the y-axis are these outcomes that look at these different policy issues. Right? So the way to interpret this, for instance, in the second row, is that providing politicians with this report about voter preferences leads to a 10.5 percentage point increase in how much they think voters think the issue is important. So in other words, what this graph is showing you is that for these issues, climate change, pollution, and minority rights, you see significant updating in terms of what politicians think voters want. Okay. And if you go back to this graph, these are precisely the issues in which there's a gap in the first place, right? Now, for the issues in which there's no gap, these ones down here, we see no treatment effect. Right? So there's no updating happening on the issues that they already knew they were good at estimating. So the way we interpret this is that there's significant learning taking place, right? You tell politicians, what voters want, and they update what they think voters want, right? So the way to think about this is like a first stage of the analysis. This just shows that I think our treatment worked. The second thing we did is we asked politicians, what do you personally care about? What are your first order preferences? And so what you see here, if you look at the third row, is that providing politicians with this informational treatment leads to a 9.8 percentage point increase in how much they care about this issue, pollution. Right? We see no increase in their support or their concern with climate change, at least not in a statistically significant sense. But we do see updating on the issue of minority rights, right? Which again had that gap in the descriptive analysis. So we think, the way to interpret these two graphs is that there's some learning happening. Politicians are even updating their own preferences. So next we want to see if this led to a change in the support for various types of policy. Right? So we asked them how urgent it was to undertake policy action on these different issues. We asked about rising sea levels, flooding, extreme heat, deforestation, and air pollution. And what we see here is that providing politicians with this information led to no increase in a perception of urgency on these issues. Even though it led to some learning and some updated preferences, it didn't translate into concrete support. We also asked about these specific policy issues, right? So a blanket ban on deforestation, as well as support for a carbon tax. And again, we find that the intervention had no effect in increasing support for these concrete policy issues. So these are, just to summarize this experimental intervention, what we find is that politicians are learning, right? They learn in the face of new evidence, and they're even nominally updating their own personal preferences. But this learning doesn't translate into support for concrete policy action. And we think this is sort of puzzling, right? Politicians are updating, they're learning. I see someone shaking. Yeah. So I'll get there, right? So we think this is sort of puzzling, right? At least in theory, based on this sort of toy model we introduced at the beginning, that politicians aren't moving to the median voter in the Indonesian context, right? And so the next part of the paper, the next part of the project is to try and explain what we think are theoretically inconsistent findings. And so what we do is go through two explanations, and I hope this gets to the shaking head that I just saw. The first explanation is that it's possible that there's just limited scope for updating support for policy action. On average, politicians in Indonesia misperceive voter preferences for environmental issues, but not all do, right? Some are quite good at estimating it. And for those that are already good at estimating voter preferences, this could be driving down the estimated treatment effect, creating what we might call floor effects. And so the solution here is to construct a measure of, at baseline, how incorrect policy or second order beliefs of politicians were. So politicians who have a high level of misperception are those who say at baseline that voters don't care about the environment. And I just showed you that they do. But if a politician initially said that they don't, then they have high levels of misperception. But if a politician said that voters do care, then we say they have low levels of misperception. And then we rerun the experimental analysis. And I want to draw your attention to this right-hand panel, right? So here you see the effect of our intervention on support for this policy issue among politicians who had low levels of misperception. And here you see no effect, right? There's no scope for updating in the event that you already hold correct beliefs about what voters want. But for those politicians that had high levels of misperception at baseline, we see a huge level of updating, right? When you give them this information, they come to support this policy issue more. So we think there's, sort of limited scope for this informational corrective in this context. The second explanation, and I think this is more persuasive and hopefully addresses the sort of concern, is that the costs to environmental policy action are too high. It's not about voter preferences exclusively, right? There's this what we call D parameter that are imposing costs on policy action. Many local elites in, say, rural Kabupaten benefit from the status quo of policy and action, which is typically characterized by environmental exploitation. Through campaign finance, politicians may be receiving rents from these local elites, which would prevent, in turn, voter preferences from converting into genuine policy action. And so what we do here to sort of engage this possibility is we examine the effects of the informational experiment according to a proxy for local levels of clientelism. And this proxy, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, I think it's really interesting. This comes from data collected by Vincent Tanutama, who's he's currently a consultant at the World Bank. And basically what he did was he scraped all the data from the KPK website from a system that requires public officials to report their assets. And we use this data to construct a standardized index based on the asset valuation of the most senior 20 officials in each district in Indonesia. And we basically make this assumption that a high standardized measure of assets of public officials correlates with high levels of clientelism. Now, this is, I think, perhaps debatable, right? But I think on balance, public officials on paper are not paid enough to own 5 or 6 houses, right? So I think there's this assumption that, well, if you have high assets, there's some other manner in which you obtain them, right? So we can, I think, debate this, but this is sort of the index that we use, right? And so what I show you here on the x-axis are places in which public officials on average have low levels of asset wealth. And then over here are those places in which they have high levels of asset wealth. And then these are the estimated treatment effects of the information on support for these policy issues. And so again, looking at this right panel, what you see is that places in which politicians have low asset wealth report stronger support for the policy after having received that information. But places in which there's this high measure of clientelism, you see that in fact, providing them with information on voter preferences led to a decline in support for deforestation, right? They learned what voters wanted and they said, oh, no, we don't want that anymore, right? And so I think this provides support for this idea that there are these extra legal costs to policy action. Yes.
I went too far back, but I was vertical learning was conscious. So they're all statistically insignificant.
So no. So I broke it down graphically for our purposes here, but in like a traditional interaction model, it's statistically significant, right? I mean, this in the interaction model, what matters is the slope of these coefficients, which is in fact statistically significant. But just for ease of, I didn't want to put a table on the thing. Yeah.
Just to the fourth quintile on the carbon tax proportion on the left, what do you think explains the difference between that and the third quintile? It drifts much more into the like, support for carbon tax after they receive that information. What do you think sort of explains that?
No, this is
No, for the carbon tax on the left, not for the
the carbon tax.
Yeah, what do you think explains the sudden shift back up very slightly, but still noticeable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so that the sort of formal interaction model on the carbon tax isn't statistically significant, so I don't want to overinterpret the very slight difference here. You know, one of the things that we encountered with the carbon tax outcome is that there's just a low level of baseline knowledge about it on the part of DPRD2 candidates. It's really not a local issue, right? We were sort of just including it to get a sense of sort of support for perhaps issues that we thought were generically being discussed. So, you know, it's possible that what this reflects is some underlying correlation between asset wealth and knowledge of the issue itself, right? But again, I don't want to overinterpret this. I mean, we're talking about a very slight difference. It's probably a function of chance alone. Okay, I gotta wrap up. So here's my conclusion.
Okay.
So like I said, voters care about environmental issues more than politicians. This is the first descriptive finding. The second finding is that politicians underestimate voter concern for environmental issues. So in and of itself, I think these descriptive findings are important, right? And they should, they speak to, I think, several different issues of policy concern in Indonesia today. Excuse me. Providing politicians with this information led them to update their perceptions of what voters wanted and also led them to update some of their own personal preferences. But it did not lead to a change in support for concrete policies. And so what we do is we introduce this simple model of costs, clientelism, and misperceptions to try and diagnose what's preventing learning from translating into support. And so like I showed you in these most recent 2 analyses, this additional information was effective for heavily misinformed politicians. So we think that there's some scope for these sorts of low-cost informational interventions, but only if you're really misinformed in the first place. But on balance, we think the stronger evidence points to this constraining role that clientelism plays in converting voter preferences to policy action, which will perhaps not surprise many people in this room, but is ultimately the punchline of this research. So with that, I'll stop and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. You can tell that the audience enjoyed it because of the number of interruptions. It's usually a good sign. So we'll take a few questions. Okay, Greg and Marcus. Marcus, we kind of like a millisecond for you, Greg. So. Oh, yang senior dulu. Yeah. Sorry.
So many thanks for the presentation. I suppose, were you surprised at the level of politician misunderstanding of what the electorate's concerns were about environmental issues, given that not only do they have a lot of access to survey information, parties, individual candidates, all the time continuing polling on these things, but also they have their own local networks and their brokers who are feeding information back to politicians, to candidates all the time about what people are talking about, what people think is important. So given that background, are you surprised that when you did your surveys, so many politicians seem to have badly underestimated voter awareness and concern for environmental issues?
Yeah. Yes. But I think diagnosing it, so I guess another way of answering this is, I think if we'd done the survey at the DPR level, for instance, I think knowledge of environmental issues and concern the gap would have been smaller, right? In the sense that I think those candidates are consulting polling numbers more than DPRD2 candidates are, right? But your second point about networks, I think speaks to what we found most surprising, right? Which is that there was this gap on environmental issues in terms of politicians' knowledge of what voters wanted, but there's no gap on these traditional issues like health and education. Right? And so that was to us the most surprising finding, right? We thought that there would be gaps on all issues. But the fact that there's no gap on these traditional welfare issues, we sort of puzzled over it for a long time. But then I think one of the hypotheses that we have speaks to these networks, right? Which is that politicians cultivate support by not necessarily throttling, but enabling access to services like health and education, right? And it's in this context that they develop a keen awareness of how much voters want health and education. But something like pollution is an issue that's really outside the purview of a local politician to provide, right? In other words, in a patronage democracy, they're not able to throttle access to something like clean air. And so they don't have incentives to develop a keen intuition for how much voters want these things. Does that make sense? So I think like this is, the surprising thing to me is that there's this variation along policy issue area in trying to explain that. And, I think, I don't know how to design a study to get at this, but I think that's something that we're really interested in. Does that answer your question, Craig?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Kind of answered the question. Yeah. Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. Very good presentation. But my sense was that you went quite soft on the voters, actually, in this case, with very blunt instruments that I think might overstate the actual preference for environment policies. I mean, you asked them, is this an important issue for you? But the really important question is, how much are you prepared to pay for effective policies in that area? And I think that's actually where politicians have a very good sense where the limits that price is. And we have this in many other areas of opinion polling in Indonesia, where there's a very big gap between a general question on an issue and then the same sort of the outcome on a more concrete issue. You take the issue, for instance, of dynasties in Indonesia. You ask the general questions, do you like political dynasties? They no, but then in concrete cases, they vote for them with very large margins. And so with the issue of environmental policy, there are just examples, and Jokowi is very much aware of this, that when it comes to the price being paid, that voters actually punish politicians who implement these policies. The one big collapse in Jokowi's popularity was the increase in fuel subsidies in actually in late 2014, and then the collapse of its popularity came in early 2015. Of course, this wasn't an environmental policy, but yeah, in a broader understanding of the issue, it would be one. Indonesia continues to subsidize the use of fossil fuels, while in other countries it's being taxed. And voters punished him for the fact that they weren't supposed to pay the price for it. The second time he's done it, then he showered people with money before he reduced subsidies again. So again, my point here is, I think you need actually to ask the voters more critical questions. Because you asked the politicians quite detailed questions about their policy preferences and support, but with voters, you were content by just asking them, is it important for you or not? And I think that really explains the outcome of what you're observing.
Yeah, no, I think that you're totally on the money. And I appreciate you pushing us on this. My co-author and I were talking last week. You know, we have this sort of simple model that emphasizes the costs to expressing voter preferences, right? But we don't do anything in the study to actually try and capture that, right? But that's precisely what you're talking about, is that are voters willing to undertake costly action to support environmental issues? It's one thing to say yes in the abstract, but it's another thing to dedicate your time to sort of supporting these sorts of issues. And so we're trying to think about, you know, one thing we could do is ask them the concrete policy outcomes, like a deforestation ban or carbon tax or whatever. But one of the things that we want to get at is like the rank ordering of policy action. Like, for instance, you know, this fuel tax or the fuel subsidy issue that you're talking about, you know, that improves on environmental margins, but it bites on, say, pocketbook margins, right? And so how are voters thinking about this particular trade-off? You can think about sort of pollution and a ban on use of burning, right? I mean, in a lot of communities, for instance, this is a matter of sort of pocketbook issues, right? It's simply cheaper and more cost-effective to engage in burning. How much are they trading that off against these environmental concerns? The issue that we've run into is how to design a survey question that gets at this, right? It's hard to I think, design it. You can ask straight up about a sort of policy issue that they might support or not, but it doesn't get at the sort of concreteness of the trade-off. And so if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear it.
Just maybe because you asked.
Yeah.
I mean, ask voters directly, you know, how much are you willing to pay for a policy that would reduce pollution, for instance? You know,
like how much would you pay in Bolivia?
Are you prepared to give up a certain percentage of government assistance to you if the government is using that in order to reduce pollution? Yes, no, I know something of that kind.
Yeah. I have one more response to
sure.
Marcus's question, because you know, you're talking about how voters punish politicians who support environmental action. And if you remember that sort of third slide that I showed you about support for or concern with pollution, and I broke it down by province. In fact, the provinces least concerned with pollution, or at least nominally say that they're least concerned with pollution, are the ones that in burning season are most exposed to it, right?
Lots of coal.
Yeah, so it's like Kalimantan, Bengkulu, these places on Sumatra. It's like, these are the places that are least concerned with pollution, right? And so this could reflect some sort of dynamic that you're talking about, right? In which these are the places that have been targeted for enforcement on this issue. And thus voters are saying, actually, we don't care about it. We cared about being able to burn so we could save money on our bottom line. So, you know, I think there's some evidence that speaks to that. Yeah.
So Ed had another question, and then I'll go to Blaine, and then we have 3 online. So we might sort of start to make our questions pretty succinct, if that's okay. So Ed, do you want to go?
Yeah, actually, most of what I wanted to ask or say has already been covered, but just in response, how would you get at how voters sort of rank their preference? Wouldn't the easiest way to just do a conjoint experiment with politicians with various policy preferences and then see how voters do respond to, you know, the environmental versus the health versus the education. Wouldn't that be the easiest?
Yeah.
way to do
I mean,
Love conjoints.
yeah, I gave you my rant against conjoints yesterday, so I won't rehash it here in front of an audience. You know, one thing I worry about with conjoints like that, it's just like the information overload, right? You know, you give voters a profile of a politician who says they care about these issues in this order, and it's like, you know, if I'm a survey respondent who's getting paid $3 or $1 to do this thing, I'm just clicking through. I'm not, you know, which maybe I should do a face-to-face survey, but even in that context, I think there's exhaustion that happens. But you know, I think that could be good. I think I like Marcus's suggestion. I think a little bit more about freighting it with like an actual money thing, like how much are you willing to actually give up in order, so to get at the trade-off.
Yeah.
That's
it?
harder.
No one will want to pay any. Ideally, that's
So I think Budi Resasudarmo's head of the Indonesian project is in Tokyo. So I think he's done some surveys that actually do this sort of thing, looking at what people are prepared to pay for different sorts of intervention.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I
Yeah.
have about 5 questions from Woody online, but.
Oh,
what is
Budi
the-
online,
what
oh
is
gosh.
exactly on this?
Let's
where
get to
he's-
Budi and then we'll go to
Yeah,
Blake.
he
Yeah.
just says he's not sure that respondents are actually gonna reveal their true preferences, and you need to have a strategy to force them to reveal a
Yeah.
preference. And multiple questions could be an example where you ask them to choose between the environment and a certain amount of money, so.
Yeah.
That's kind of exactly what Marcus was saying.
And Paul Kenny and I did one on corruption.
Okay.
Actually failed, but but yeah, he has some ways to do it as well around the
Okay.
price people are willing to pay to bring that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
yeah.
I'll follow up and
Perfect.
get the actual question
Yeah.
text from folks. But this is very useful. The one thing I'll
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
while we're still on this point, is, you know, one of the costs to voters expressing their preferences that we think about is that they believe that politicians are going to underdeliver. And so they say it's not worth it in the first place to even express these preferences because we don't think that politicians are going to follow up. And so what we were thinking about doing on one of the next online surveys is basically just giving a condensed form of those graphs showing that politicians do in fact update, right? If we provide them with information, they learn. And then see if voters then imagine that the costs of communicating their preferences are indeed lower, right? But we worry that this is too many, like,
Right.
it's like the Inception movie, you know, it's kind of like,
But was there any, are there not class differences in terms of the voters who put environment, who place a priority on environment climate change? Because the stuff we've done on DPID guys, they often say that they're really only talking to and
Yeah.
interacting with sort of lower middle class and poor
Yeah.
voters, and they're the ones who care about health and education. They actually do a lot less interacting with
Yeah.
the upper middle class, where you would expect. And that's the constituency that might have more of these sort of pro-environmental policies, and then there's a mismatch because politicians might not be spending as much time with them,
yeah,
or it's simply an order of preferences, they're not going to be punished,
yeah.
you know, for the environment.
So I didn't look specifically, but we did some weighting and there were no differences between
Okay.
the unweighted and the weighted when we included a class variable. So I don't know how much variation there is. I mean, when it comes to this pollution issue, I think it's top of mind for communities irrespective of their class position, right? I mean, you know, if like your drinking water is being polluted by
Right,
natural resource extraction or
yeah,
whatever, I mean, I think it.
yeah, sorry, I shouldn't have slipped that in, that was
Yeah,
very naughty.
sorry.
Blaine, okay.
I think, rather than being late, a great presentation. I've had a chat to Vincent.
Yeah.
About your clientelism index.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if that might not be subject to quite a bit of measurement error.
Yeah,
Self-respondent value of asset reporting. I mean, what's to stop them from thinking that all those reported a fairly low amount of assets or just lying?
yeah,
And what repercussions does that have for you?
yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely happening, right? I mean, I think if you are like you know, yes. Short answer is yes, but the point is that it's a standardized index. We're not trying to get the actual intercept. We're trying to get, in like a comparative sense, how these different districts stack up to one another, right? And so there's two ways to go about this. So Vincent's, I think, done it in two ways. One way is to just say, we don't care about the actual rupiah amount. What we care about is we assume some standard measure of bias across all districts that's sort of depressing this measure, but then that's standard, and so we can just assume that the inter-district comparison is still valid, right? Another way is to look at changes over time within district to create that standardized measure, right? Which would get at this issue a little bit more. If you assume that districts, for instance, certain districts are more predisposed to have larger scale lying and misrepresentation on these things, right? So I think there are two ways to go about it. The short answer, which is a sort of cop-out, is that Vincent was the one that was really involved in construction of this index. So I need to spend, I think, more time consulting it. But I think it's promising, right? I mean, I think there's.
I mean, the other thing you might do is look, if you were able to show, for example, that your index of this relates well, and it's strongly associated with some of the other measures.
Yeah.
UNED has a index of clients, and I'm using a couple of measures of clients that I'm writing.
Yeah.
And Vincent said he would do that, but he hasn't gotten back to me on that. So
Yeah. Well, I'll put the three of us on an email and we can write a paper about the performance of these different indices.
That would add a little oomph to your measure.
It does correlate. I checked. You know, these BPK audit scores,
Sure.
which have a lot of challenges as well, but it correlates with these, right? So places.
That's two fictions that are well paid.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
I'm gonna take a couple of online, do you want to read out 2 or 3 questions simultaneously?
Yeah.
So that we
We have a lot of questions online,
just
so
do
it's
2 or 3.
difficult to pick a few, and I know Woody has a lot that he wanted to be able to say, so perhaps what we might do, Nick, is connect you with Woody afterwards.
Yeah,
and give you the full
that'd be
list of questions. But let me take a look here. We have a question from Lydia, and she says, thanks for the presentation. The heterogeneous effect of information for the politician is very interesting, especially the slide on asset side versus support on environmental policies. It would be interesting to map this more. The politician who runs on health policy issues, for example, might think that environmental policy will impinge on budget for his health projects. If you've got any thoughts on that. Then we have a question from Hetty, who mentions that there are 2 types of information provided regarding environmental issues and policy actions provided to politicians and voters: deforestation ban and carbon tax. Is there any assumption in your research that these 2 issues are understood equally by voters and candidates? And the questions are quite long.
Okay.
I know, yeah.
I am paraphrasing,
Yeah.
sorry.
So-
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, thanks.
So on Lydia's question, you know, so the question is, if you're a politician who's running on, say, a health issue or education as your core platform issue, how does this information, how do you respond to this information differently than if you were, say, running on an environmental issue? I mean, I think certainly very differently. The report that we provided them contained information about voter support for, say, health or education issues as well, right? So I think, you know, a politician could have made what they wanted to of this report. It was just that there was the biggest gulf on these environmental issues. I think one of the challenges with exploring this is that, you know, how do we classify whether a politician is like a health politician or an education politician? And I think one way is to make use of these campaign platforms that they have to submit to the KPU, but for most politicians, these are not super serious statements. But it's one way of, I think, getting at this that I'll try and explore. So thank you for that. Henny's question, is there an assumption that voters and politicians know equally about these policy issues? I think initially, yes. I think we had erroneously assumed that politicians would be engaged with these issues equally. In hindsight, that was folly, right? I think politicians don't think much about a carbon tax, right? They do think about deforestation, and this is reflected in the percentage of politicians who in that question said they didn't know or they didn't answer. So there's much more for deforestation. I mean, excuse me, for the carbon tax.
I'm gonna take one more online, actually. Yeah.
One of Woody's original questions for you was wanting to know how you sample respondents within the top parties.
How did we sample? So we like I said, we sampled 80 Kabupaten. And then within each Kabupaten, we sampled 10 candidates, but we focused specifically on candidates that were in the top 3 list positions. And those that were in those top 10 parties that I mentioned, but within that, it was totally random, right? So we could have gotten 10 list position 1s or 10 list position 3s, for instance. What we did do is if we weren't able to contact one of the randomly sampled candidates and they were from list position 1, from say Petiga or Golgar, when we resampled another candidate, we resampled from the same party. So that's how the sampling procedure works. But one thing that I think is neat is that it's very difficult to get representative elite surveys because non-response bias is really high, because it's hard to quantify or identify the universe of cases from which you might sample. But one thing that's really neat about this survey, and I hope it'll have some appeal to folks, is that we think this is a genuinely representative sample of not a super elite, but a reasonably elite population in Indonesian society. Great question.
Yes, please.
Just a quick one. Is there any specific reason why you use something those elite component and is there any criteria that fits?
No, we just used a population-based random sampling procedure. So districts were weighted according to their population and then we randomly sampled, yeah. We excluded Papua and Maluku actually, which is important. It would have driven costs up exponentially in order to reach a lot of those candidates. But that has important implications, I think, for the results, right? Because a lot of these environmental issues are especially salient in Papua and Maluku, but we were unable to access candidates in those regions.
Also, one presumes the level of monitoring was quite high.
That's right, correct.
And one more online and then, yeah.
I have a question from Rafi Mohammed online. He says, "Hi Nick, I'm interested in your use of the word perceived cost to action. This is speculative, but I think that the low policy demand from the voters and the high cost of actions are not the only factors that shape the lack of care by politicians towards environmental policy. I believe that the trend is also influenced by perceived benefit of actions. Presumably, the high cost would not become as significant if the benefit and the risks were worth it. In contrast, if the benefit of actions is not worth it, politicians will be hesitant to deliver even though the voters demand it. I'd be thankful if you have some insights or studies regarding this benefit of actions that we can look at."
So I do not have any studies to reference, but I take the point, right? A perceived benefit is just a negative cost, right? So I think the model can, taken to its extreme level of flexibility, I think the model can account for this issue. The reason that we don't emphasize benefits to action are in large part because we see very little policy action on this issue, right? And so we're thinking more about the costs rather than the benefits, because if the benefits truly loomed larger in the aggregate, we would see, I think, more policy action. But again, I think we're thinking very flexibly about the cost and the benefits here, at least trying to.
One more question.
I think, and this sort of follows up from the trying to survey voters based on what their concrete views say on the sensitive issues in which they actually have to pay pocketbook interests to. I think just the problem would be because it was mentioned when we went over the list of legislators, right? The problem is not a lot of you actually know really what some of the dividends it would be from some things promoting a carbon tax or say banning deforestation. So I guess the thing there to be wary of it if this to go back to the idea with voters and asking their view on that, I feel like there'd be a problem where voters might know much less even than what legislators would as well on what I would expect a voter with either a low or almost zero knowledge on what the dividends that they would get from carbon tax effect. They almost certainly would probably expect to not want to pay anything on any of these questions asked about. It's not a question of 2%, 4%, it's a question of any percent at all.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, I think the carbon tax is the extreme case of this because its benefits are so diffuse. I think you can imagine other environmental policy issues in which voters can be assumed to have a very good mental model of the trade-offs, right? So if you're a farmer in Kalimantan, for instance, and you're facing a environmental policy, say a blanket ban on the use of fire for the conversion of let's say secondary forest or whatever, you know how much it costs to rent the tractor that would be required, and you know how much it costs to burn the land. And you also know how unpleasant it is to inhale the smoke from the fire, right? And so you have to assume, I think, in that context, that that farmer is making a mental calculation in their head.
Yeah.
Suppose you're not a farmer, but you're in that same region and you work in IT in the nearby urban space, you know how much that pollution is unpleasant to you. You know how much you have to pay personally for, say, a ban on use of fire for the conversion of forest, which is zero because you don't do it. And so they too have this mental map, right? So I think there are other environmental issues that can work around this issue. I think that, yeah.
And I encourage those steps.
Yeah. No, but I appreciate being pushed on this because I think it's, I think this is what we'll try and do in the next stage of the project, is try and get at voters' sort of preferences in a truer sense about these issues.
Blaine, and then I think Asha is trying to work out in one of the questions online. So Blaine, and I think that's time for one
One
more.
question, I mean, this is well outside my area, wouldn't the carbon tax be more appropriate level at the national level, the district level?
Yes, for sure.
So why are you asking them, what, are you, isn't that looking at one of your questions?
That was one of the questions. Yeah. Yeah, you know, when you run surveys, often in hindsight, you ask yourself, why did I ask this question? And I think this outcome is a little bit of that, right? I mean, deforestation is, I think, a very local issue. The carbon tax, I think, you know, what we were trying to get at was like the sort of salience that these politicians were attaching to these more concrete proposals. We had initially a sort of longer set of proposals, and we winnowed it down due to concerns over survey space. And I think, you know, the short answer is, in hindsight, I agree with you. You know, it's a national issue, which I think is reflected in the results. There was no updating on that particular outcome.
Asha, Catherine, was there something for online that you wanted to?
Well, there's still, I mean, a few questions from Woody, and actually Woody would love to be able to speak out in person, but we don't have that.
Or does that
capacity set
function?
up
Oh,
at the
okay.
moment.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to take from Woody's questions was related to the notion of trust. And politicians are most likely know their voters well. How do you convince them that your information is true?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we gave them, you know, I should have included in the slides, like as an appendix, the actual report that we gave them. You know, we had a nice graphic design. We had this like slick report. We gave them an explanation of the methodology. So one of the challenges that we ran into is about 15% of the politicians, the enumerator judged to not have understood the material that was contained in the report. In other words, they didn't understand like the sampling procedure that we were explaining, and we actually excluded those respondents from the analysis. But those that did understand, the response from the enumerators or the reports from the enumerators is that the politicians were quite keen and excited to be given this sort of personal, what they saw as a personalized report. And reflecting this, the politicians, after the study, widely circulated this report among other candidates within their own party, and even across party lines, right? And so this report was circulating within the kabupatens in which the study took place. So I think this reflects the politicians believed the content of it.
It's gonna, oh, sorry, it's gonna follow up, yeah.
Mine was a sort of a general one, so.
Yeah.
Well, because we're getting toward the end of the time, you said you're planning to do a lot of other things with these survey results. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of a preview where you're going.
Yeah. Well, those papers aren't written, so this is going to be a little bit more back of the envelope. So, you know, one of the things we'd hope to do is something similar, but with identity politics, in the sense that, you know, there's a large literature in political science and political economy that points to this idea that identity politics is this elite-led phenomenon in which politicians use these appeals as, you know, what Marcus calls these entrepreneurs of grievance to try and generate electoral gains, for instance. And so we're going to use the candidate survey as well as the voter survey to see if that's actually happening. Are politicians making these appeals as first movers and then voters in turn responding? But as you know, identity politics wasn't very salient in this recent election, which is obviously, I think, a good thing. But it sort of gave limited scope for us to be able to do this study. The second thing that I'm doing, and this is more ongoing, is I'm looking at election denialism in Indonesia. And so I think the basic premise of this study is that we can see how support for democracy changes as a function of an electoral outcome, right? And I think we know that if you lose an election, you're more likely to say the results are bogus, the election was rigged, there was corruption, right? We think it happens in America, it happens everywhere.
You spent far too much time in California.
Yeah, I know, right? So we know that this happens, but what we don't know is what the a priori predictors of this are. Not everyone that loses an election says that it was unfair. So which sorts of candidates are most predisposed in the event of a loss to say that the election was unfair? So there's, I think, several hypotheses that we can test. So one is that financial exposure matters a lot. So if you put in a lot of money and then you lost, right? It seems likely that you're going to allege foul play because you need to find a way to recoup those costs. Another thing, and we were talking about this last night at dinner, in the survey we ask about a battery of psych questions, right? So you can imagine if someone scores high on the narcissism index, it's possible that in the event of a loss, they're going to be more likely to say that the election was rigged. And then we look at baseline levels of support for democracy. So maybe if you support democracy a lot, when you lose, you're going to say, well, it was free and fair, right? No harm done. And so this is, I think, one of the next papers I'm going to work on in this project.
Maybe one last one.
Oh, okay.
So just a quickie, it's
Yeah,
from
sure.
one of our students, Joshua Walker, online, and he
Oh,
just says, in my experience, most Indonesians understand climate change as an issue relating to sampah, urban sprawl, air pollution, not carbon emissions. So he's asking voters whether climate change is an issue that matters to them meaningfully different to ask them whether pollution is an issue that's different to them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we see similar levels of voter concern for both pollution and climate change. So about 49% of voters say climate change is very important, and 57% say pollution is very important. So I think this suggests that the two are tracking similar phenomena. But again, like I said, we're running these surveys continuously. And so one thing we can do, and I'm going to jot this down, is that we can include questions as follow-ups to that issue or to that question to see what voters are actually thinking about when they talk about climate change. Right? And I think hopefully that can parse this question. And that actually brings me to another point, which I meant to say during the presentation, and I should have said it when everyone was still here. This online survey that we're running every week, we're happy to include questions from people who are interested in various issues relating to Indonesian politics. We have 20% of the survey space every week is dedicated for graduate students and faculty to include questions. So please take us up on this offer, right? We have survey space.
Oh, how awesome and generous is that? It's really great. Yeah, it's really great. Crowdsourcing as well.
Yeah.
Some interesting questions.
The data is available.
Yes, yeah, the survey data is, we haven't made the candidate survey available yet. That's going to be more sensitive because we have to de-anonymize things. And we have to figure out, because if you know a candidate's list position in their party, in which kabupaten they're running in,
Yeah.
you can identify them, right? And so we need to figure out how to present the data in an anonymous fashion.
But did you take them from all dapil within a couple of patterns? That's good.
Yeah, so we sampled across dapil, that's correct. But so if we just remove the dapil, for instance, you wouldn't know. But then you could narrow it down to 4 or 5 people, which is still too much.
Right.
But we'll figure out a way, and we'll share the candidate data. But the voter data is available right now.
Sorry, the voters, what characteristics can you capture from the survey? You have income, asset, what else? The jobs, sectors
Yeah.
where they work.
Yeah.
Do you have them?
Yeah. The job variable is a string variable, so it's not
Because you
a.
seem to underexplore the voters heterogeneity in
Yeah.
this presentation.
No, I mean, that's right. And this is one thing that Alan and I, my co-author, have been talking about, is like, in this first draft of the paper, we're focusing almost entirely on politicians and the production policy,
Right.
rather than on how voters figure into the question. And so I think in the next draft, I think these comments have been really good and convinced me that in the next draft, we need to focus more on voter concerns.
Great. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of Nick's presentation. Really fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick, for giving us your time, and thank you to everyone here in person and online as well for such engaging questions and feedback. Obviously, there's going to be, not just this paper, but many other fascinating papers that are coming out of this data set that is ongoing. The collection process is ongoing. And just to reiterate, Nick is happy for people to offer questions, propose questions
Yes.
that could go into future surveys, and he's also happy to take recommendations on the paper title.
Yes, we need a better title.
But actually, the paper you shared with me, the title is different, and
Yeah, I know, we went
that's
with
cool.
climate crisis and policy in action in Indonesia.
It's not too
It's still,
I like that.
we need something better,
Anyway, so thank you so much for coming to Canberra, Nick. Thank you to everyone again, and that's it. Good luck with the next version. And good luck in business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
My,
Great.